maybe I need to be closer. Is that better? Okay, thanks. So thanks for being such a prompt audience. I'm really impressed everyone is here well before 7 o'clock. Thanks for coming, and thanks on behalf of the Windham World Affairs Council, and thank you to the Brooks Memorial Library for hosting us. I'm Meryl Sobner. I'm a member of the Windham World Affairs Council and a relatively new resident of Brattleboro, and I'm happy to be here and meet you all. I'm currently still Assistant Director of the European Union Studies Center at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Thanks to the pandemic, I get to do that remotely for a while. I'm also finishing a doctoral dissertation there on exactly civil society responses to populism in Central and Eastern Europe. So I was very glad to learn that our speaker was coming to town and would be talking on this topic, and I volunteered, I think, to host the talk. So I also am excited to talk about this because I firmly believe there's much we as Americans can learn from the experience of populism in this region. In the last decade, I was really struck by the similarities between Trump and style and playbook from Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and also President Miloš Zeman and Prime Minister Andrej Babiš of the Czech Republic. Since both leaders have recently left office, it seems like an opportune time to reflect on the experience and see what lessons can be learned. And with that, I'll introduce Martin. He holds a doctorate in political science from Charles University in Prague. His research is focused on non-democratic regimes, the era of communism, Czech communities abroad, and Eastern European anti-communist elites in the United States during the Cold War. He's published more than 300 articles and 20 books. That is impressive.
24, in fact.
Wow. He also participates in election observation missions organized by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And Martin is also a coordinator of the Czechoslovak Talks project, which contains fascinating oral histories of those who left the country during non-democratic regimes and settled abroad. I urge you to go to the website. I lost a fair amount of time reading the oral histories there, and they were quite enjoyable. And with that, I'll turn it over to Martin.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a great pleasure to be here. I am based in Prague in the Czech Republic, but I come like 3 times a year to the States, and it is my first time in Vermont, so I'm very excited about that. As mentioned, I'm both historian and political scientist, and today I'll talk about the rise of populism, one of the burning topics these days, and I will focus specifically on the Czech Republic, or Czechia, the country I come from. Many American journalists still haven't noticed that there was a split or separation of Czechoslovakia, and that now we have 2 separate countries, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, or Czechia and Slovakia, and they still keep, call it Czechoslovakia. That's a better case. Sometimes they even call it Chechnya, which is a bit different country elsewhere. Anyway, thanks, as you can see on the map, thanks to its strategic position right in the very heart of Europe, the Czech Republic, or the Czech lands, have always been a meeting point, a center of business and culture, and a place where the West met the East. Thus, we can also see it as a kind of small laboratory, where the latest trends and the mood of the population copy what is happening in the European Union in general. If we use the language of computer game players, the Czech Republic is like a demo version of a real game being played beyond its borders. Before the pandemic, my country had one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe. Its economy was growing, the quality of life in general was very high. But still, we Czechs were labeled troublemakers and an inner opposition in the European Union because of our lukewarm approach towards further integration of the European Union and the cooperation with our partners on various issues. A general tension within the European Union, which has lasted for some years now, has also led to the rise of populism, one of the very serious threats to democracy and democratic development. So I would like to talk about it more in detail because the ongoing war in Ukraine, it also brought some increase of populism and populist tendencies, and populism became a burning topic on a daily basis. As you can see, the Czech Republic is just a small country in Central Europe with 10.5 million inhabitants, with its economy strongly tied to the larger German economy and with the most of the foreign trade with other member countries of the European Union. It's been a stable member of the EU since 2004, so for the past 19 years. And there is no real alternative for us than a deepening integration of the European Union. However, Euroscepticism has dramatically increased in the past few years. What does this term actually mean? Euroscepticism entered the political discourse in mid-90s. Initially, it was almost exclusively used as an expression focused on all kinds of opposition, criticism, and negative attitudes towards the European Union and the progress of European integration. But in many cases, Euroscepticism was just vague and subjective in meaning, lacking any proper framework, and attracted primarily less educated and less politically knowledgeable individuals. But this has changed in the recent years. Public opinion about the European Union is now playing a major role when considering membership of each state in the community. The revision of the treaties on which the European Union is based, and the enlargement of the Union. We usually distinguish between hard and soft Euroscepticism. Hard Euroscepticism refers to a complete rejection of EU membership, hand in hand with a rejection of NATO, whereas soft Eurosceptics support just a limited EU membership, but they are very critical of various aspects of integration, such as the cross-border movement of people, adoption of the common currency, euro, or giving up powers and responsibilities of the local/state government in favor of a supranational leadership in Brussels, meaning the European Commission, European Parliament, and other EU institutions. The current situation in the Czech Republic in many ways reflects the past. While they are not under, direct rule of another power, many Czechs feel dominated by larger EU nations. This is especially true with Germany, as the Czechs already have, negative historical association with Germanic people who dominate EU decision-making now. Let me remind you that Czech lands were under German/Austrian rule for more than 300 years, and many Czechs see their national identity as having been defined from the outside. Criticisms of the European Union bring up this historical threat to our national sovereignty, and the three historical periods in which Czech lands were under the rule of foreign powers, and the Czechs as a nation had to make concessions to survive. I'm talking about three periods. That means 300 years under the Austrian or Habsburg rule, then the Nazi occupation during the World War II, and Soviet supremacy between 1948 and 1989, while after August 1968 it was a direct military occupation by the Russians. So this is reflected in many criticisms of the European Union that depicts the Czech Republic as a pawn controlled by the West. Thus, EU encroachment on domestic issues is seen by many Czechs as a clear evidence of a foreign rule. There is a feeling of lost sovereignty as a result of EU membership, but by its very definition, membership means that any member state of the European Union will simply have to give up certain aspects of self-governance in order to fully participate in the European project. So Eurosceptics are able to tap into these nationalistic sentiments in order to gain support for their cause, whether or not the loss of sovereignty is real or just imagined. And there are many factors that may influence the growth of Euroscepticism, but one of the most significant is the expansion of the EU authority into domestic matters. Critics have said that there was a democratic deficit in the governing of the EU, that the decision-making processes in Brussels are too distant, too strange, and too complicated, that EU leaders are not responsible for their decisions to the Czech voters and the public. The EU bureaucracy, inefficiency, disrespect towards opinions, feelings, and needs of the people in the member states, and the fact that the European law sometimes overrides the Czech constitution and the Czech laws, in many cases have been criticized by all parties across the Czech political scene for the past 19 years of our membership. But recently there have been, a few issues that made Euroscepticism a mainstream and a serious burning topic on a daily basis, as I said. First of all, it was the Brexit in 2016, which also became a clear warning for the EU elites that the Union needed immediate reforms. I believe that the Czech Republic should be in the middle of these changes for the better and the building of a new EU vision, because it's a win-win solution for everyone. We can show that we are creative, active, respectful to our partners, and not merely the ones who only criticize, who don't care, sit in the back, let the others do the work, and shout only when we don't like something. Some EU critics among Czech politicians even called for a similar referendum, as was the British one, preferably leading to a Czechit. But it is highly unlikely because, as I said, there is no real alternative for us than a deepening integration. And the Czechs actually benefit greatly from the European single market and EU structural and investment funds. We were able to draw billions of euros from these, or tens of billions or hundreds of billions of euros from these arrangements in the past 19 years, so that we could build highways and roads, protect our environment, renovate cities, modernize industry, allow our students to get university degrees from prestigious West European universities, etc., etc. And yet more and more people were calling for Czechit. But why? Again, we have to look at this trend from a broader perspective, and we see that the rejection of the EU and common European values are closely tied, or is closely tied to populism. Political parties lacking any ideological foundation and using populist rhetorics or appeals emerged in Central and Eastern European countries in general in late 1990s. These parties did not adopt any radical ideology until 2010, 2011, at least in the Czech case, and populism was not a prominent element of a Czech politics, meaning mostly parties and movements at the periphery of the political spectrum used some kind of populist rhetorics. Compared to other countries in the region, the Czech Republic had one of the most stable and relatively closed party systems, and it was characterized by almost exclusive unidimensional competition, meaning there was one major party on the right, there was the Civic Democratic Party, and one major leftist party. It was the Social Democracy or the Social Democratic Party. But then the new generation of voters grew up, and these seem to be characterized by a lower level of identification with traditional left-wing, centrist, and right-wing political parties, and they rather show a tendency to be attracted by simplified populist promises and therefore to be linked with the new protest or anti-establishment parties and movements. It is, pretty much same in other EU countries. These political entities usually divide society into two antagonist groups, meaning the pure people, the good ones, versus the corrupt elites. They argue that politics should be an expression of a general will of the people. They emphasize a real or just imaginary crisis or threat. They claim to speak for the good and honest people, and they attack the out-of-touch elites. You certainly remember that your former president used the claim "draining the swamp" in DC during his presidential campaign back in 2016. So we had, very similar cases in the Czech Republic. Furthermore, it is often very problematic to identify these parties and movements on the left-right political spectrum, because very often they combine elements from both ends of the spectrum, plus they're using this populist language. And with no question, there is also a very important role of charismatic leaders. Or rhetorical features such as tabloid style, dramatization, and the use of social media to spread fake news and disinformation. If we take a look at populism, at a phenomenon of populism from the European perspective, we see that the populist parties and movements have established themselves as powerful political force in many countries, and even integral members of coalition governments. We have the Lega North party in Italy, we have the Danish People's Party in Denmark, we have the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, True Finns in Finland. In Germany, it's the Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, whose influence and power was exponentially growing as a reaction to the politics of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who led the country between 2005 until 2021, I guess, yeah. So, in the Czech Republic, we also have our small Trump, billionaire Andrej Babiš, who is the 5th wealthiest man in the country. He's also a man surrounded by multiple corruption scandals. And Mr. Babiš is actually a very interesting case. The red cap inspiration is obvious. It says "Stronger Czechia." He was actually born in Slovakia. In 1990s, he founded a conglomerate called Agrofert that operates in the fields such as agriculture, logistics, energy, chemical industry, forestry. Today, more than 230 companies are covered by the umbrella trademark Agrofert, worth of $4 billion. Kind of a nice family company, right? Andrej Babiš decided to enter the politics in 2011, claiming the traditional Czech political parties did not do a good job in ruling the country. So he founded a new political party, or better to say, movement, called ANO. ANO means yes in Czech, but it's also the abbreviation of the actions of dissatisfied citizens. He mainly criticized the corruption affairs that were, in his opinion, much more frequent and worse than in the neighboring countries. And after he stepped into the political arena, many political scientists used the term Berlusconization of the politics, named after the Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who also established his own party. He owned the biggest media in the country and basically dominated the public space. And Babiš very successfully followed his steps. He bought 2 largest daily periodicals, he bought a radio station, he bought a TV channel, and he's been using them effectively to influence the public opinion. His marketing team prepared very smart face-to-face campaign in the streets. Sometimes it looked like that Babiš was everywhere. He handed out donuts at subway stations in Prague. He was visiting regions with mobile booths with fried chicken. He was meeting the people and presented promises of higher wages, higher pensions, and benefits for various groups of the population. We have to admit that he really devoted an incredible amount of time, money, and energy to the campaign, and it was worth to him. Because ANO movement won the parliamentary election in October 2017, and he became our prime minister for 4 years. Fortunately, ANO movement was defeated in the last parliamentary election that took place in October 2021. So Babiš was ousted from power, but he still keeps very strong supporter base, and ANO is the strongest opposition party. and also Babiš ran for president 2 months ago. We have a bit different, political system. We have a parliamentary system. The prime minister is actually head of the government, and president is head of state, but he has, not so many responsibilities and not so much power as the American president. So Babiš was running for president. He made it to the second round, where he was fortunately beaten by Petr Pavel, retired general of the Czech army, known abroad mostly for his long career in NATO, where he chaired its military committee for a couple of years. And during this very long presidential campaign, also the war in Ukraine belonged to the most frequently used or discussed topics. And that brings us back to populism, because it was Andrej Babiš who brought new unflattering dimension of populist rhetoric to Czech politics and public space. He obviously wanted to use the war for his own purposes, because he sensed correctly it stirred up emotions in the population. I will talk about Ukraine a bit later, but let's get back to the criticisms of the European Union. The Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary and Slovakia, 4 countries in Central Europe, maintain closer relations than they do with the rest of the European Union through a local alliance called Visegrad Group, or just V4. In recent years, each of them has had to deal with increasing populism, more or less connected with negativism, focused either on corruption, the heritage of communism, and dissatisfaction with the political development after its fall in 1989, and also the transition to democracy and capitalism. And again, an EU factor plays a very important role. It's the national interests versus the directives from Brussels. And people from the former Soviet bloc are actually very sensitive about any pressure from the outside. I have already talked about the feeling of a German dominance that many Czechs share, but there is another similar comparison. You know that for more than 4 decades, following the end of World War II, the communist regimes of Central Europe, including the one in Czechoslovakia, received strategic decisions from Moscow alone. Official propaganda talked about the Soviets as liberators, protectors, greatest friends, equal partners, but in fact, these countries were nothing more than satellites, completely subordinated vassals of the Soviet Union. We called these regimes people's democracies, but in fact, they were far from any participation or involvement of their citizens in decision-making. In late 1980s, the rulers in the communist countries were so distant from their dominated citizens, and the whole communist regime was just a rotten castle falling apart day by day. And so the current relations between the old members of the European Union, meaning the countries in the Western Europe, and the new members, meaning the countries from a post-Soviet space, and the abyss of misunderstanding between Brussels and the individual member countries sometimes remind one of the old times before the fall of the Iron Curtain. The analysts and sociologists say that there is a widespread mood in the society that the old values and guarantees are gone, that the government is more of an obstacle to achieving prosperity than a facilitator, that the mainstream media are not telling the truth, and therefore it's necessary to look for alternative sources of information. Simply put, that there is some dark conspiracy, some deep state behind all of us. And populist parties, movements, and politicians are naturally trying to take advantage of it in order to gain political support. So this narrative of omnipresent conspiracy and threat was to be seen during the so-called refugee crisis as well. That is the term given to a period beginning in March, April 2015, when rising numbers of people arrived in the European Union, traveled across the Mediterranean Sea or overland through Southeast Europe. Speaking of the Czech Republic, vast majority of the people would have preferred to remain completely untouched by the influx of non-European foreigners. And some politicians, including Andrej Babiš, who was member of the government back then, since 2014 he was a Minister of Finance, and since October 2017 he was a Prime Minister. He immediately understood that the fears and concerns of the population could bring him a political profit easily. And he also began to emphasize issues such as the spread of infectious disease, in terrorism, and the formation of ghettos and isolated Muslim communities as a clear consequence of accepting refugees. And Babiš also claimed that he and ANO movement are the only ones who could protect the people, our way of life, national interest, European civilization, despite nefarious interests of some dark forces in Brussels. Another, I would say, shining moment of populism was the coronavirus crisis, of course. Various conspirational theories about COVID-19 and its origins, about the real impact of the vaccine on people's health, changing of DNA, stuff like that, found enough listeners among frustrated citizens who blamed the government for the economic difficulties and impoverishment they were facing because of the quarantine and restrictions. The situation in the Czech Republic was pretty much the same as in the United States. We were under lockdown for like 6 months. The schools were closed for the entire school year or academic year. We had to wear face masks in the public for almost a year. And of course, no one was happy about that, meaning additional points for the populists. And we barely had time to recover from the pandemic, and we had to face the consequences of the war in Ukraine. The Czech Republic is one of the European countries that has taken most of Ukrainian refugees. According to the latest data, my country, which again has the population of 10.5 million people, has granted temporary protection or asylum to 500,000 people of Ukraine, which is like equivalent to 5% of our population since last February when the conflict began. Also on March 17th, meaning only 3 weeks ago, the Czech Republic signed into law a package of 3 government bills, collectively referred to in the media as Lex Ukraine, providing the war refugees with health insurance, full access to the labor market with no restrictions, humanitarian allowance, social services, childcare, etc., etc. In exchange, I would say Czech companies expect that they will be allowed to participate significantly in the restoration of Ukraine after the war is over. You know that from the beginning of the conflict 13 months ago, 27 member states of the European Union have shown incredible unity and strength and have provided Ukraine with significant political, financial and military support, and also humanitarian aid to refugees. In addition, the European Union adopted a whole scale of sanctions against Russia and Belarus. The EU agreed on, I think, 10 sanction packages so far, which included the closure of EU airspace to all Russian aircrafts, prohibition of transactions with the Russian banks, prohibition of new investments in the Russian energy sector, prohibition on most of the imports from Russia, sanctions against companies and individuals linked with the Kremlin, and freezing or confiscation of their property, and even more restrictive rules for Russian citizens when applying for the visas. Now it's more complicated, more expensive, it takes a longer time. The Czech Republic belongs to the, I would say, hardliners in the European Union, and says very clearly that Russia is the aggressor and it must pay. It needs, some courage to act like that, because the Czech economy always relied heavily on energy imports, and virtually all its gas originated in Russia before the war. This left the country scrambling for alternative suppliers, and remarkably, at the end of 2022, we had reduced our Russian gas dependency from 97% to 4% only within 12 months, So we were able to replace it with this liquefied natural gas coming from Norway, Qatar, or even from the United States, which is distributed to the Czech Republic through a special terminal in the Netherlands. So this went well, but half of Czechia's oil still comes from Russia, and we still need to find a new supplier of raw material for 2 nuclear power plants. So, our energy dependence on supplies from Russia is obvious, and it needs to be seen as a security threat as well, because Kremlin, doesn't hesitate to use gas and oil as a political weapon or as a tool of pressure. So in the past year, the price of gas and other commodities doubled or even tripled in some cases. And that was, of course, another tempting chance for the populists to show themselves, to organize public protests, to criticize the government. As mentioned earlier, the Czech Republic has become one of the most outspoken supporters of Ukraine. But there is this newly formed, I would say, populist and anti-establishment movement involving a very strange mixture of communists, socialists, as well as far-right radicals. And they began to spread the narrative stressing the worsening macroeconomic conditions, especially high inflation. As we speak, the inflation in the Czech Republic is between 18 and 20%. The populists say that we are going to suffer, we are going to freeze during the winter, we are going to lose the money and living standards only due to our support of Ukraine. And they present a very simplified solution. The war is just a minor regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We should not intervene. Weapon supplies mean only extension of the conflict. They say that the best solution would be to force Ukraine to give up part of its territory, thus to satisfy Russia, which will withdraw its troops, the war will be over and everyone will be happy again. So they say that they are the only ones calling for peace, but in fact, if you examine further their communication with the public and the content of their appeals and messages, it's full of anti-European, anti-American, anti-West and xenophobic narratives, depicting Putin and his regime as guardians of traditional values and Christianity, defending them from Western decline and decadence. Not a single word about the war, about the war crimes, about bombed cities, about mass graves, about kidnapping of children and other atrocities committed by the Russian aggressors. So there is an obvious bias and prejudice. So for now, these false populist saviors attract only a fragment of the population, according to the latest polls, between 5 and 8%. And the vast majority of citizens support the continuation of financial, material, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, more than 75%. The longer it goes on, the lower the support. But for now, we can say that, for the upcoming months, the Czech citizens, and thus also the citizens of the European Union, strongly stand behind Ukraine. Although the warmest wishes of all of us should be for a quick end of this war and not seeing the suffering of the Ukrainian people any month longer. Now let me share a more personal experience from Ukraine. As mentioned, from time to time, I take part in the election observation missions organized by the OSCE, and that brought me also twice to Ukraine. It was back in 2014, so just after the Maidan Revolution. I was there for the presidential election in May 2014, and then for the parliamentary election in late October 2014. And I must say that I came to understand that the country was in a very deep problems even without any Russian interference. Meaning the level of corruption, backwardness, you left Kiev, the capital, and you were in a different world. Underdeveloped 19th century-like areas, villages with no proper infrastructure, with no hopes, no light at the end of the tunnel for most of the people who simply didn't have enough money to bribe the authorities and they didn't have the right connections. The elections were a perfect example. On paper, everything looked fine. There was a new election law based on the recommendations from the European Union. Everything looked transparent. The members of election committees seemed to be very well prepared and ready for the election day. But we saw something fishy. There was something in the air. We saw obvious intimidation of voters. Sometimes the secrecy of voting wasn't ensured. We saw some campaigning in front of the polling station. We saw some bribes, and above all, there were strange guys in black leather jackets with 3 cell phones who were in every single polling station. They were receiving orders from someone else, and they were giving orders even to the chairman of the election committees. And these guys were present at every polling station and also at the district election committee, where the most important part of the E-Day, meaning the tabulation and the tabulation process and the counting, took place. So I was very frustrated about that, and many of my Ukrainian friends actually shared the same frustration. So although it's a bit strange to say that, but I think that the war, although it's a catastrophe and tragedy, might well become a great chance and opportunity to start over for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian nation. Before the war, in 2014, I was told that like 70% of the money for investments, to build new highways, were simply stolen by the local oligarchs, by the local criminal circles, which is insane. A modern European countries simply cannot work like that. So I believe that this is a great chance for Ukraine to start over. If they really mean it, if they want to become a member of the European Union anytime soon, and they will apply for the membership, and thus to become a member of Western structures, they need to start from scratch, with themselves, with very deep reforms, which will be painful. It will take a long time, but I'm sure that they will succeed. I had a chance to observe the election in Kiev, in capital. I was also in Kharkiv, which is the second largest city with Russian-speaking population just in the east, just 20 miles from Russian border. I was also in Ivano-Frankivsk region, which is in the west. We were in small villages in the mountains, in very remote areas, and we saw pretty much the same situation. The people were very excited, and the turnout, was high, between 70 and 75%. But still, I think that the election, the results of the election were already written by someone in charge, long before the E-Day began. So that was the situation in 2014. Since then, Ukraine undoubtedly made an incredible jump, a step forward, to becoming a modern European country. But still, I think there are still, some elephants in the room, as you say, and that when this war is over, hopefully soon, that they'll need to continue with very deep reforms and transition. So thank you very much for your attention. If you want to spare my vocal cords right now, then feel free to email me your questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer it now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. If we do have questions, we have a microphone in which you can use, and we may have some questions too from our online audience. If there aren't any, I have lots of questions I can ask. Anyone? No? Yeah. So I was wondering, I have a couple topics that you could maybe say a little bit more about, to spare your vocal cords if you can. But one was, maybe you could comment on the ongoing legacy of the Czech Communist Party. You had mentioned that it's part of this coalition of far-right anti-war but maybe you could talk a little bit about the Communist Party in modern democratic politics.
We became technically a communist country after the communist takeover in February 1948, but the fact is that the communists or the Communist Party won democratic election in May 1946. After the war, they became the most powerful political force in post-war Czechoslovakia. One of the reasons was that they came much better prepared from Moscow, where they spent the war years. They learned how to penetrate all important sectors, and they occupied crucial positions in the regional and governmental bodies. So they were preparing themselves step by step from May 1945, from the moment of the liberation of the country and the collapse of Nazi Third Reich. They were preparing themselves for the inevitable conflict with their coalition partners, meaning with the non-communist parties, and for the takeover. Then they were in power for 41 years until the Velvet Revolution. And since then, they had a very strong member base, and they were from 1990, from the first democratic elections after the revolution, they always were in the parliament until 2021. And the reason is that Andrej Babiš and his ANO movement, this protest anti-establishment movement, simply took almost all their voters. They just cleaned their membership base. So some analysts say that was a good thing, that we finally got rid of this communist legacy, after 30 years after the revolution. But we need to understand that the people, the frustrated citizens, are still here. They just moved to someone else. So who knows? Maybe if some new, young, progressive communist leader will show up, they will join him again. Who knows? Sir.
Can I ask you a question about the role of religion in Central Europe? I mean, the ecumenical evangelicals here have got enormous power.
Yeah.
Is that going on in Central Europe?
Let me be frank, the Czechs are probably the most atheist, secular nation in Europe. Although we are surrounded by the Poles, by the Slovaks, by the Austrians, by the Bavarians, all religious people, we simply don't care. There is a very strong tradition of Protestantism in Czech lands. Since 15th century, there was a very important priest and thinker, Jan Hus, who was burned by the church in 1415. And since then, we always kind of opposed the Catholic Church. And I'm a historian doing research about the Czechs in America. So many people left the country in 19th century because of this religious oppression. They always saw the Catholic Church as the strongest ally of the Habsburg dynasty, of the oppressors, of the Germans. So they rather moved to America as the land of religious freedom. So I would say the religious question played an important role back in the 19th century, but now I don't even know the latest polls, how many people actually go to the church and are affiliated to any church, like an institution. I think it's like less than 10% maybe, yeah. But it's really, it's unusual compared to the situation in Poland or in Slovakia, for example.
And actually, I do have a question from the chat is, how has humanitarian aid been affected with the U.S.?
With the U.S., you mean?
I don't know. Somebody typed this into the chat. It has, I assume what they mean is, has humanitarian aid to the Czech Republic been affected with the U.S.?
Or humanitarian aid in Ukraine?
To Ukraine? I'll ask for clarification.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Carry on.
Given the Czechs' history with Russia, is there a fear in the Czech Republic now that Putin's gambit in the Ukraine is part of expansionism?
Well, we are members of NATO since 1999. We are in the middle of the European Union, so I don't really think that people are afraid of that. And you see the situation on the fronts, in Ukraine. If you look at the map from June of last year and from last week, the front is pretty much the same. There's no advance. The Russians or the Russian troops simply don't have enough, power and enough weapons to move forward. So I don't think it's a real issue. And I think, we are living in exciting times. I think that we'll be reading about them very soon in the history books, because what happened in just in Euro-Russian relations in past 13 months, that's incredible. We got rid of the Russian energy dependence. We froze like 50% of the assets of the Russian central bank. It's really incredible. And I think this is kind of a second stage of the collapse of the Russian Empire. The first one came in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now the other satellite countries like Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, they're seeing that the powerful Russian bear is probably not so powerful, and that they might also, it might untie their hands, and they might, establish closer relations with Western countries as well, because the Russians simply don't have enough power and instruments to prevent this. So yeah, it's interesting.
What about China?
Yeah, China is I think the most important player, sitting in the back, in the shades, and waiting for its opportunity. Yeah.
You spoke to some of the reasons for the rise of populism in Central Europe. You talked about the immigration crisis, you talked about the pandemic, you talked about just kind of against the swamp in Brussels. How much influence do you think Moscow has played behind the scenes in the rise of populism in some of these countries?
A significant, role. There were many European leaders, including the former candidate of French presidency, Marine Le Pen, who expressed vocal sympathies towards Putin and other leaders in Kremlin. Kremlin obviously was sending some money to another populist party in the Czech Republic called Freedom and Direct Democracy. There were some, close ties between Orbán and Putin. So yeah, I think, and again, this hybrid war, and the disinformation campaigns and spread of fake news through social media, and all the trolling farms, run by Russian hackers. That was a serious issue in the past few years. But now with the war, Russia simply had to open its cards. So now the enemy is obvious. It's clear who stands against the European Union. I think that Putin really miscalculated this whole idea of war. But I had a chance to read like 8 different biographies of Putin, and all the authors claim that he's the guy living in the 20th century. If you take a look at a picture of his office, he doesn't use any cell phones. He doesn't use internet. Basically, he's living in a bubble, and all the news from the outside world have a form of a short situational reports delivered by his generals and by his advisors. So he really might have, believed that Ukraine would fall apart, that the people would welcome Russian troops as liberators. So I think it was a great surprise for him, the development of the war and the Ukrainian resistance.
Do you have any idea about the demographics of the country? I mean, or how does populism play with young people versus middle age versus all the old people like us?
Yeah, as I said, many old people, retired people, see the old guarantees are gone, and they have less money, and with the inflation rate and with all the problems, they thought that 20 years ago the situation was much better, and even if you go deeper into the history, that under the communists the life was easier and better. But there are also some young people who seem to be more attracted by the populist parties, because they see no hope. Prague and other cities are becoming very pricey. So for a student or someone at the beginning of his or her career, it's almost impossible to afford apartment in Prague, or to have kids, or to buy a car. So I think we call it in Czech social scissors. Do you have the same terms in here? That the abyss between the rich ones and the poor ones is getting bigger. So yeah, that's I think very important issue for the future, for the upcoming few years.
To what extent does anti-Semitism play a role in populism in Central Europe or the Czech Republic specifically? I mean, it's part of the flavor of American populism for sure. So I'm just wondering how it plays out there.
It's not an issue in the Czech Republic. I think the situation is a bit different in Hungary, for example. But no, as I said, we are just secular people, atheist people. We don't care who is Christian or Jew or whatever.
I was in the Czech Republic for a couple of years, 90 to 92, and the populists at that time often used the Romani people.
Gypsy, yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, now there's immigration, they have so many more choices now, those populists. But I'm wondering, what is the status of the Rome in Czech politics, I guess?
Not a significant one. Yeah, Romani people or the Gypsies, they are like 200,000 out of 10.5 million living in the Czech Republic. They are considered like poor and non-educated people who only cause problems. But you know, I think that the younger generations got integrated and they study at the universities, and the situation was much different in 1990s, for example, when they were really living in the tents, outside of towns, and they were stealing, but now they are more civilized. Also, I wanted to mention something. Yeah, go on. Next question, maybe I'll remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what you thought might last longer, the Russian economy or the Ukrainian economy. I remember, 13 months ago when all of the sanctions were leveled, and I thought it would just be 2 or 3 months before the Russian economy would collapse, and it just seems to be incredibly resilient. Also, the Ukrainian economy seems to be quite resilient, given the fact that, most of the men are at war, and the country is basically in a permanent state of emergency. Which country do you think will have an economy that will last longer than the other?
Well, I don't think there is a Ukrainian economy, because the European Union is pumping money for the past 13 months in Ukraine, and I think that we need to be patient, because the sanctions will have a serious effect on the Russian economy, but it will last a bit longer. We cannot see immediate results, and I think the situation is changing already, because the Russians, they have almost no money left.
I was wondering, what do you suppose Dubček might have done during the Prague Spring before the Russian tanks rolled in, with probably so many Soviet apparatchiks within the government? What do you think he could have accomplished, you think?
Just for clarification, Alexander Dubček, he was a Slovak leader, he was the chairman of the Communist Party or general secretary in 1968. He was the one who stood behind the Prague Spring, meaning the liberalization process of the socialist regime. He had this claim, socialism with human face. He simply tried to fix socialism and communism after the atrocities of 1950s and after all the crimes the communists committed after the World War II. So we just wanted to reform and fix communism from inside. Of course, Kremlin and Brezhnev didn't like that because the Soviet leaders thought that the reforms in Czechoslovakia simply went too far, and based on their experience from Hungarian uprising in 1956, they didn't want to allow the same thing, that the Soviet supremacy in Eastern Europe would fall apart, because they were afraid that the very same liberalization process would also come to East Germany, to Poland, to Hungary again. So they just decided to intervene. So this Prague Spring lasted for only 5 months, and then it was over. Dubček and the progressivist or reformist wing of the Communist Party, they were ousted from power, and they were replaced by the apparatchiks you mentioned, obedient Trojan horses receiving orders from the KGB and from Moscow. I don't know. In general, 1968 it was a very exciting year. There were riots and serious civil protests taking place in Germany, in France, in Italy. Here there was this tension because of the war in Vietnam. I don't know. It was simply too short, to make any conclusion how it would continue without the Russian interference.
Okay, I've got another one. What do you think of prospects for democracy in the United States? And are you worried, this is a follow-up to that question, are you worried about U.S. leadership waning, or is that a good thing?
That's a tough one. It is my 50th time in the States. For the first time I came in 1995 as a 12-year-old boy, because my father used to be a tennis coach and he took me for US Open. So that, for a boy from Prague, it was incredible to see all the lights, of New York City, of Manhattan and New York City. It was something. And since then I, was here for, as I say, many, many times. And even me as a visitor and a foreigner, I can see how America has changed in past 2 decades. I need to emphasize that some of the terms like socialism, radicalism, or reform, moderate, they are a bit different here than in Europe. What you would consider extreme left or socialist, that's completely normal in the Czech Republic. I always say that since we are a civilized, you would say socialist country, our healthcare system is for free, our education is for free, which is something very rare in the United States, unimaginable. So it is, for the European, it's very complicated to make comments on American politics. I just see kind of a crisis of leadership. If both parties are able to, select leaders who are older than 75 years old, then there's something fishy, Are there any younger, more energetic leaders in their mid-40s? I don't know.
Yeah. And I have another one, Becky. Any comments on the outlook on the new formation of China, Russia, and Iran relationships?
Would you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah. Is my mic on? Oh, thank you. I'll turn the mic on too. Are there any comments on the outlook on the new formation of China, Russian, and Iran relationship?
It seems like a new axis of evil, right? Well, as I said, Russia is, China is a very important player on this chessboard. For example, our former president, Miloš Zeman, he was very pro-Chinese and pro-Russian. He simply wanted to attract Chinese investors to invest in the Czech Republic. He was talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Nothing of that happened. But it has a lot to do with Chinese business manners, meaning that they don't invest immediately. They need to just check on their partners. They are in touch with you for a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, because they are thinking in the long term. For them, their business strategies last for 50 years into the future. And our businessmen and companies became very, very nervous about that. So where are the money? Where are the Chinese investments? We need to keep going. So nothing of that happened. And since our new president to the office only 3 weeks ago, he completely changed the direction of our foreign policy. His first call with a foreign leader was with the president of Taiwan, you know. And now, recently, a speaker of our house went to Taiwan and took 150 Czech businessmen with her. So it was the biggest delegation ever of Czech business, and they came to Taiwan, you know, to establish new type of cooperation, just to get rid of Chinese influence for good. And there is some hope that the largest how's it called, the whatever company, the largest producer of the microchips based in Taipei, that they are going to build another factory in the Czech Republic in the future. So that's a big thing, right? Yeah. So, and even myself, I'm going to Taiwan in September for a week to give a lecture tour and to have an exhibit of the photographs of a Czech traveler who visited Taiwan in back 1920s. So I'll let you know how this new Czech-Taiwanese friendship looks like.
I think we have time for just one or two more questions, if there are any. Milt, it's coming behind you.
Is it working?
Yes.
I recently read an article that noted that the casualties suffered by the Russians are about double what they were in Afghanistan before they withdrew from Afghanistan. At the same time, I've read an article by a correspondent in New York whose mother-in-law is a Russian in Russia, and they've been in communication. And she absolutely believes they're winning the war, and what they're being told is completely different from what we understand is happening. My question is, I don't know how much exposure you've had in Russia, but how long can Putin keep the Russian people totally unaware of what this adventure is costing them?
You know, as a historian, I focus myself primarily on the Cold War era, and I did a lot of research about communist propaganda, and I can tell you that the Russians are using the very same rhetorics and the very same lies for the past 100 years. I can't, you know, understand why someone still believes that crap, but, you know, there are still many people, like the Russians, you know, imagine the Russian civic society has been suppressed for the past 10 years. There's no independent press, no independent media. You just need to follow the official, you know, propaganda from the Kremlin. There is a nice historical comparison. Our first democratic president, Václav Havel, you know, there was this Velvet Revolution in November 1989, at the end of the Cold War. He was elected president, and his first trip or a state visit was in the United States already in January 1990 or maybe February, and he gave a talk at the Congress for both the House and the Senate, and they were asking him, so what would you need from us? What the Czechs, the Czechoslovak Republic and the Czechoslovak people would need from the United States, you know, from the leader of the free world? And Havel said, he was a philosopher and a writer, and he said, you know, let us help the Soviet Union on its very complicated path to freedom and democracy. And that was a very deep thought, you know, that was a very important thing. He didn't think of us, of the Czechs. He understood that all the changes that the Soviet Union or Russia is going through, that they are serious, you know, that they are losing their empire after 80 years, and that we need to help them to prevent, you know, civil war or you know, some really serious issues. So I think that now we should be patient with the Russians. I mean, with the ordinary people. Believe me, I have rich experience with them, with their selfishness, arrogance, you know, false idea of their supremacy. But I still believe that there are some, you know, smart people who won't let this lunatic in the Kremlin to use the nuclear weapons or to destroy everything. But as you know, Mel Brooks sings, let's hope for the best, expect the worst, right?
appropriate note to end. I want to thank Martin for, Nicola for joining us here, and all of you for coming out this evening, and thank you.
Thank you.